Hello, everybody, and welcome to GlugNet. My name is Stephen Ball. I'm the current president of GlugNet. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Joe Guadagno, who will be talking to us about dev containers. What are they, and why should we be using them? But before we get to that, a little bit about GlugNet. The Greater Lansing User Group for .NET Developers, otherwise known as GlugNet. We are based out of Okemos, Michigan, as pictured here on the map. Our meetings are free and open to the public, held on the third Thursday of every month. The best way to find out more information about what's coming up is to go to our meetup page, meetup.com/glugnet. Our meetups are typically recorded and posted to YouTube by our own Sam Nasser. You can find a QR code on the screen now, or there is a link there as well, youtube.com/@SamNasserMVP to find those recordings. A couple of housekeeping items. We are always looking for lightning talks before our featured presentation. If you have a 10 to 15 minute talk on a technology topic that you're passionate about, we would love to hear you. You can either contact myself or Joe Kunk, and we can get you scheduled before a meeting. Tonight's presentation is interactive. Please feel free to ask questions, or if our speaker has questions for us, feel free to pipe up and answer those questions. If you are unable to or just uncomfortable speaking, that's totally okay. We also have a chat feature here in GoTo that we'll be monitoring for questions along the way. Otherwise, we just ask that you please stay muted. That way we can all hear and enjoy tonight's presentation. Additionally, at the conclusion of tonight's presentation, we will have a survey available to all attendees. It is 6 questions, and we are looking for feedback in 2 areas primarily. First of all, how did we do as an organization promoting the event? And secondly, what did you like and not like about the presentation itself? Every bit of feedback we receive is anonymous. So please fill out your honest feedback, whether it's good, bad, somewhere in between. We want to hear it. And then after the survey closes, and in this case, it's closing tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Eastern, a summary of those results will be sent to you, Joe, for your use in future presentations.
Awesome.
At this point, I would like to recognize our sponsors for the evening. NIS Technologies, who is providing us this go-to session, and the .NET Foundation for their financial support of GlugNet. And now, as they say, it is time for our featured presentation.
If I was only yellow, I'd look like that guy in the front row over there. Let me share my screen. Tell me if you can see it or not.
Yes, I can.
Okay, cool. If there are any questions, feel free to raise them. The chat is on that window, so I'll occasionally look over there, see if there's anything in chat that I can address, but I'll, for the most part, just keep going unless there are questions. So a little bit about this talk. We're going to talk about dev containers, what they are and why you need them. A little bit about me. My name is Joe Guadagno. I am a Senior VP of IT at Real-Time Technologies. We write software for mobile carriers. And let's get my mouse going. Here's my contact information. If you want to reach out to me, you can take a screenshot with GoToMeeting, or they'll also be available at the end. There's a QR code on the next screen that you can see to get the sample code and any references that were made. Throughout the presentation, you may see links on the bottom of the screen. Most of them start with jjg.me/container. So it'll be easier if you just write it, but since it's recorded, you can go back and look at them. Here's a QR code or the shorty link to the slides if you want to see them. There's no sample source code because everything I'm just going to build is going to be built on the fly, but you can at least get all the reference material from here. So the agenda, we're going to talk about how you get started with dev containers. We're going to then talk about what a developer container is. Now you might notice that I said dev container or developer container. The naming has gone through several different names, which I'll cover more. I like to say dev container because it's easier, but the technical name is developer container for them. Then we're going to look to see how we build containers. We're going to build probably 3 different containers, and then we're going to customize the last one or show you how to customize it pretty easily. And then we're going to use our containers in Visual Studio Code. You can actually also do this with JetBrains Writer, and Visual Studio has a beta preview feature of being able to use dev containers in Visual Studio. I'm going to show how you can create a dev container using multiple containers. We'll do one container for .NET and one for SQL Server and show how we can use them together. And then we're going to show you how you can open up projects on GitHub using dev containers. So getting started. First thing is why you want. So I love this image. Say it works on my machine one more time, I dare you. How many times we've gone through and built apps and then we deployed them to production and it didn't work, or you hand it over the wall to your SRE or server support people and it doesn't work. Well, dev containers aims to hopefully prevent that, but also make it easier for you to share what your environment looks like without having to give a README file or create a 300-page PowerShell script that creates and downloads everything you need. If you're doing dev containers right, it'll kind of throw everything in one neat little package that you can use, which we'll see throughout the presentation. So what requirements? You basically need the Docker engine, and then you can use either a Docker desktop or Rancher on Windows. If you're using Linux or Ubuntu image, you use Docker CE. Basically, you need something that can run Docker containers. You need Visual Studio Code for production. Like I said, JetBrains Writer and Visual Studio proper have support for it, but it's still in beta or pre-release. You then also need what's called the dev containers extension for Visual Studio for this to work. So let's build some containers. That's enough of the slides for now, but before we build them, we want to talk about what they kind of look like. So this is your typical environment. You have, let me get my mouse pointer out. Let's do laser pointer. So you have these 3 different sections, the inner loop, the outer loop, and then the deployment. So the dev container works within this portion of it. As you can see with the inner loop, this is what the developer has. You want to be able to share the operating system, runtime, and shared libraries across all 3 platforms. When you're in a dev container, you want things like the compilers, the SDKs, the library, the build tools, and utilities. So if you're doing something like Node, you want NPM on there, or Yarn. If you're doing .NET, you want the .NET SDK and those build tools. But you definitely don't need them on your production environment. And when you're in your dev tools, you want things like your debugger and the personalization, any productivity tools like Resharp or extensions like that. So let's see what makes up a dev container. Dev container is basically made up of 3 parts. You have the template. The template describes the operating system and what libraries and SDKs are going to be available. So in our first 2 examples, we're going to be building a Linux-based template that has .NET in it. Our third one is going to be a Linux-based with a with a Ruby SDK. And the reason why I just chose Linux-based is because they're a lot easier for containers. Windows containers are a lot bigger in size. You then add on top of your container the different features. These features are things like your compiler, any build tools that you need. So in our .NET one, we're going to have the .NET SDK, then we're going to have MS Build on there, which is the compiler. For the Ruby one, we're going to have the Ruby SDK, then we're going to have the bundler, which will build our Ruby app. And then you have the dev container itself, which has our productivity tools, things like your linters or your Azure CLI, your AWS CLI, any of your debuggers, and personalizations that you might want, like the color scheme and things like that. So we're going to look at all these things in a minute. So templates that are available, you can go to that link below, which we're going to go to in 2 more slides. There are templates available for Alpine, Debian, C#, C# and Microsoft SQL, Java, Jekyll, Ruby, you name it. If there's a programming language out there, there's probably a dev container for it. And if not, you can actually create your own pretty easily by going to containers.dev, and it has everything you need to build your own custom one. For features, there's probably even more features. We'll take a look at that right after this slide. Things like the AWS CLI, Azure CLI, .NET, Hugo, PowerShell, NPM, Yarn, you name it, it's there. But enough of that. Let's go take a look at them. So let me know if I need to zoom in or not on the screen. Looks fine on my screen, but I got a gigantic monitor here.
Yeah, it's a little small.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, 150 is probably good. So the first thing you need to do is with the Visual Studio Marketplace. Now you notice it says dev containers here. If you go to the dev container site, it says development containers. And if you look at it behind the scenes, right here, it says remote containers. That's because that's what it used to be called. It started out as remote containers, and then it went to dev containers, then went to developer containers. So when you're searching for this, it could be in one of 3 different or even 4 different names, depending on abbreviations and hyphens. The most common one you'll see is dev containers. So once you install this, you have everything you need, assuming you have Visual Studio Code on there. So let's take a look at the templates. All these templates are available via the remote container tool, and I'll show you that in a minute once we start creating one. But you'll see that there's lots here. You'll notice that there's a maintainer list. So things that say dev container, let me zoom, already zoomed in, say dev container spec maintainers, that's maintained by the team that owns this. Now the dev containers is owned by a consortium of supporters like Microsoft, Docker, and the Linux Foundation. So there are a bunch of different people and teams that contribute to this. So there's 3 key pieces to this: the name of it and this reference, which we'll see once we create one, and then the version. This is, like anything, the versions get incremented when there's changes. If you want to search, you can use this search, which will search the first part of the template name. So here you see, if we're looking at C#, there's a plain C#.NET, there's C# in Microsoft SQL, there's C# in Node, then there's a C# with Node.js and Microsoft SQL. This one is not maintained by the dev container team, but there's another team that is maintaining it, which meant someone else created it and submitted a pull request for it. If you want to see what they are, you can just open up and you'll get everything that there is to know about it, what your configuration options and everything. We'll cover this in a little bit. But you see here all the source that was pulled in. These are all the different templates that are available. So the site is open source. You can submit PRs if there's a template that you want to create that you think is of value to the community. So let's take a look at our feature set. So our features are plugins or things that we want to add into the container that are not the operating system and or programming language, as I like to call it. So if you're an AWS shop or you're looking to publish things to AWS, you might want to add in this feature. If you're like me and you have a pimped up PowerShell command, you might want to install the common utilities one, which does things like add OMI or SZSH to your console. You can add Docker if you want. You can add Docker in Docker, Docker outside of Docker, to interact with it. You can add Git to it. For most parts, most of the plugin or most of the templates already have Git in there. You can add Hugo if you're doing a Hugo thing. You can add PowerShell. So the list goes on. You can scroll through this list and you'll see that there are actually a lot more contributors to this. So these are basically individual Docker layers that get thrown on top of yours. So that's enough about that. Let's go and actually build one. So we're going to pop over to the side and we're going to start off here. I'm going to come up. I'll zoom in to about 150%. Oh, wrong one. I'm going to zoom in to about 150%. We don't really need this window right now, and I can minimize this for now. Okay, so to get started, you'll notice here, if I look at my extensions and do dev, you'll see, yes, Joe, we'll see that in the next demo. Question was, can more than one container be used, i.e. container one calling a database in two? We'll do that in the next demo. So if I choose dev, I should be able to see dev containers. There it is. So I have that installed. So once you do that, I'm going to do Control-Shift-P, and then you'll see if I type dev containers, there's a bunch of different options available. Rebuild and reopen, add dev container, and so on and so forth. Right now, I'm going to do add dev container configuration files. First thing it's going to do is ask me, what do I want to do? Where do I want to add the configuration file? So there's two ways you can add the configuration file. You can add it to your workspace, which includes it in the local folder you're in, or your user data folder. If you plan on sharing this with other people or want it available in your version control, this is the preferred way. I've yet to find a reason why I would do it in my user data folder unless I'm creating my own special one that is like running my own containers on it. But for everything I use, I always put it in the configuration to workspace. The next thing it says is to select the container configuration or enter a container type. So I'm going to start off with the C# one for now and choose the first one. This is just going to be a plain C#. It has all the SDKs, extensions, and dependencies that are needed to build a C# app. It then asks me for configuration items. Now there are options, there's options for almost every one of the templates. And I'll show you how we can see that in a minute. So by default, it's going to give us a version for this. Now the template specifies that .NET 9.0-Bookworm is the default, but I can choose anything. If, let's say I have a C# 6 app that I need to support, I can go and install that, or a .NET app. We're just going to go with the 9.0 default. Now that those are all the options that were available to that SDK or to that template. Now it says, okay, what features do you want? For most of my containers, I generally do common utilities, because that has things like oh my SCH, as well as a lot of other command line utilities that I use. I'm going to do the GitHub CLI, and then typically SCH plugins, because I use SCH a lot. Now, I'm not going to configure any of these, but just to show you to do it. Click OK, and then I get the option to either keep the defaults or configure options. So when I did the feature set, there were options that I had to select. Each of these features also have potential configuration items, but it doesn't force you to go through all of them. So I can do keep defaults, and it will do that. It will just take all the defaults at any one of those feature sets. For this, I'm just going to do keep defaults. And then this is a new feature that optionally, if you're going to be using GitHub, will add the dependabot YAML file. I'm not going to use that since I'm not going to publish this. So we'll click OK. In about 10 seconds or so, you get a dev container file. Ignore this for a minute. We're going to do that in a minute. You see there's a folder called .dev container, and then there's a dev container JSON. Now you can view the full specs by clicking here, and then you can see the README for .NET. Now, if we looked at this file, so I'm going to do that, it's going to take us back to that template that we had open. Now you see here, it specified that there is one option for the .NET version, which has a default here. So it asks you what you want to do. If you look at it and open up the dev container JSON, you'll see this is the sample that it's going to create. But one thing you'll notice is here you see an image, and then this is pulling the image from the Microsoft Container Registry on Microsoft.com, dev containers, and then .NET :1- and then this template option. So this template option goes to these options that you saw here. Now you generally don't need to worry about that, but I like it so you can see where things are. And that also allows you to go and tweak it if you want without having to go back. So if we look at our dev container, this is the part that we selected. We selected 9.0 bookworm. These are the features we selected. We selected common utilities, GitHub CLI, and SCH plugins. So those corresponded to this feature page. So if we looked up common utilities, you'll see it specifies GHCR, IO, dev containers, features, common utilities. We go back, and that's what was here. So you can, in theory, edit this file if you wanted, but Visual Studio Code and the extension will just generate it for you. Ignore all this other stuff. We'll come back to it in the future. So now the container exists, and I want to show you there's nothing up my sleeves, which is why I wear short sleeve shirts when I do presentations. Here's my Docker desktop. I have one instance running, one container running called my blog, and one container running called dev docker, which has a bunch of, SQL Server, SQL Edge, a couple others, but none of these are running. So we're going to do the command to show it again and do rebuild and reopen. Up pops a dialog box that's building it. If we looked at the output, it's really fast for the first one. And also because I ran all these last night, unless there's some change that happened between last night and now, the image should pull in pretty quickly. But it's basically building containers behind the scenes and then adding some defaults to it. So if we go and look now, our container still has nothing here, but down at the bottom here, we have this dev container C# parentheses .NET at desktop Linux. Now, you're probably wondering where I got that name from. Basically got that name from the container itself. So right here, this name here gets converted to here so you can see it. And this allows us to, if we click on it, allows us to do a couple other things like close the container, reopen it locally, etc. We're not going to really do any of this, but if I look now at Docker, you'll see I have this new one called Interesting Ride. It's funny because there's actually a whole project on Git that for the dev containers that comes up with these names. And it's usually a 2-word name. The first one is usually some kind of adjective and then some kind of noun. And during the late October to early November, the GitHub team has a little special feature. When you build a dev container or a code space container, it has some Halloween name to it, like Scary Dracula or something like that. What are the technical requirements for a laptop or PC running containers? There isn't really, there really aren't any technical requirements. It's whatever the basic requirements are for Docker. Obviously, the more memory, the more CPU, the better, but you can also limit it. Like you see down here, my Docker, I have it limited as far as how much CPU it can use, how much disk, and how much memory it can use to avoid it. I found it works as well as on 16 gig machines as well as 64 gig, which is what I have. How does a dev container differ from a .venv? I don't know what a .venv is. Rich, if you can clarify that or come off mute. Is there an easy way to see what components are installed with a given feature? Yes. So if you go to the feature page, the same thing. If I click on the feature name, you can see exactly what happens. So the install sh is the command that runs when that feature is done. So if I look here, it's going to run a bash script that does all of this. And if there's any ancillary scripts, you'll see them here. But the easiest thing to do is to kind of go through here and look at the install. And then a lot of times they'll tell you here what's in there. Anything that's on this site has been vetted and scanned for viruses, etc. So the dev container team won't accept any PRs without the validation of them. So from what I found, everything on here has been safe. And if you want to know any licensing or anything, most of them are covered in the README file or through the install.sh. Okay. So now that that container is built, let's go back to Visual Studio. And I'm going to open up a command line. And I'm going to do .NET new. I think my syntax, I always have to double check my syntax because I tend to forget it because I don't do it too often from the command line. Console, and I'm going to name it Hello Dev Containers. So you might have noticed that an error popped up. And it says, for more information, run .NET workload update. This happens with every image. That's because when these images are published, there's generally a newer version of .NET that came out, or not all the workloads are in there. So generally the first time you do it, you're going to have to run a sudo .NET workload update. And that's going to just update to the latest and greatest for the workloads that come out of the box for the .NET container. And depending on your connection, it could take a minute, it could take a couple of seconds. It usually takes less than a minute to do, and it's done here. If you're watching, it also gives you a text to run if you want to trust the certificate. So I generally copy that and do that right away to avoid that if I'm going to build an ASP.NET app. So that on there, let's go. We see we have a folder here. If you're familiar with Visual Studio Code, it's nothing's different here. I am going to ignore that and then create a console.writeLine. I will add the debug and missing so I don't have to do it later. WriteLine, do hello, dev containers. Now I have GitHub Copilot installed, so that did the auto filling. I'm going to do console.writeLine. Hello, get semicolon. And you get your full development experience. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here, do function F9 and not put it there, but put it here. Come on, get out of my way, Copilot. There it goes. There it goes. So if I go here and I got to navigate into the hello world container for the hello world, and then I can do a .NET build. Now I want you to know the second I do this, it's going to fail. And it fails because I get this weird error that took me a while to figure out what it was, but you'll see something around the could not set file permission 755. That's basically a write permission. In newer versions of the dev containers, it runs as the user Visual Studio Code. The user Visual Studio Code does not have write permissions in here. So there's two different ways you can fix that. You can either give the Visual Studio Code user the permissions, or you can take the shortcut and edit this. Down here, you'll see a remote user. You can put in any user you want. By default, the root has all the permissions. So for this demo only, that's what I'm going to do. You're allowed to do that in demos, but in production, I do not recommend you do that. So once I save this, the Visual Studio Code extension, let me save this file first. The Visual Studio Code extension is going to say, hey, you've changed it. Do you want me to rebuild? So I'm going to choose yes to rebuild. It's going to close that existing container, and then it's going to rebuild it based on that new setting, which is basically add the remote user. If I look at Docker, I see that old one is gone now, the interesting ride. And in a couple of seconds, the new one should appear, which is code for now I get to drink water. Okay, it's done, or at least it was done. It took a lot longer to build the second time around for some reason. There it goes. Now I should see it in here, and it's musing Kilby, whatever a Kilby is. So now this one should be good. Let's open up a new terminal. CD hello, and do a .NET build. Now it builds, and now I can do a .NET run. Now I'm only doing it from the command line. In theory, you can do it from here, which I was going to do, because you see we didn't hit the breakpoints. That's because we did a .NET run. So I'm going to go here and select run and build and do a start debugging. Then it's going to build with debug on. And I hit our first breakpoint, which is a dev containers. I can see right now they only have hello world. Then I could step over, I get hello dev containers, and then I can step over and get that. So I get the full debugging experience without without leaving Visual Studio. Now, if I look at the folder that this is in, it wrote out everything to my it wrote out everything to my drive. So let's go here and see. That was the projects folder, and then the container demo, and I have everything that's in here. So I can check this in to source control, and everyone would have access to it. So to show you I'm also not tricking, we're going to go through the next demo like Joe asked about for SQL. Now there's nothing in this folder, so I'm going to close this one for now, and I have another window here with SQL Server in it. And there's nothing here. Let's zoom in a little bit. Now this one, we're going to do a combination .NET SQL. So I'm going to do Control-Shift-P, do add dev configuration. We're still going to keep it configuration to workspace. And then I'm going to choose .NET and SQL. So I'm going to do C# to narrow it down, and C# and MS SQL. It's going to ask me, you notice I didn't get a prompt for what version. They didn't, in this particular build, they don't give you an option to choose the version of .NET. I think it's .NET 8 by default. And just like the others, I have the ability to add features to it. I'm not going to really add any because we're not going to do anything different with this one. But this one also has some built-in features that you'll see. So we look at this one is slightly different. I'm going to do this and then come back and explain this file, because this actually takes a minute because it's downloading C# one as well as the MS SQL. So while I still have this, we have a name here, C# and MS SQL. You can call it anything. We'll see in the next one that we can change the name. We have a Docker Compose file. If we look at the Docker Compose, we'll see that it is creating a volume called workspaces. We have this command called sleep indefinite because we're going to be installing a database image. So this is using the SQL Server 2019 latest. We have to wait a minute now because it just restarted the container. So while this is loading, now let's go back and check Docker. We'll see that eventually we'll have another one here once it's connected. This is the previous one that we had. This also allows you to create your own custom Docker file and use it. Here we go. We're back here. So let's take a look at that Docker Compose. We'll see that it has a network mode of service DB. So it wants to connect to the DB, which means we need to have this open. To using Microsoft Container Registry, MS SQL Server 2019 latest, and it has a restart parameter set to unless stopped. So that means every time this container restarts, the SQL Server database will be brought back up, and it has an environment to set the password for the SA to password. Now, in the other version, I must have chosen an old one because there is one that actually, yeah, let me pick a different one. This is the older version. There's one now that's a little bit newer. So I'm going to close this one. Close remote connection. Then let me go through that database and delete this dev container. Let's create a new one. I'm gonna add it. forgot to open the folder. It has to have a folder in order to do this. Control-Shift-P, add configuration. Oops. That's right. I clicked a button in my mouse. Control-Shift-P, add configuration. I clicked the learn more, and that's what took me to that. .NET. Unless I chose this one yesterday. Let's see what this one looks like. I think this is one. This one has a little bit more configuration to it. Yeah, this is the one I want to see. This one has a lot more customization to it, so it looks a little bit more like what it would look like. Ooh. I'm getting an error because it's still downloading the tools. Visual Studio hadn't opened that file from the last time I had it open. You see right here, it's installing some tools. And let's close this. Oh, come on. Let's close remote connection. And then we're going to open a recent one, which is, I think it was this one. So what ended up happening is because we already had that. Why is he doing that? I wonder if it failed to create. Oh, it's there. Open workspace. Here it is. Yeah. Let's see if that works. Yeah, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry. Close remote connection. Open folder. And then do Microsoft SQL. There it goes. So you'll see here that there are a couple of customizations. So here there's one thing that says, for Visual Studio Code, I want you to add the settings, and I want you to create a property called MS SQL Connections, and then add in the following. This time I'm waiting for the downloads to finish before I click open. So what this is going to do once this opens up is I should see here it's going to install some additional tools. Why are you failing? It's not supposed to fail. Let's try rebuild container. I generally keep this open when it's rebuilding just to see if there are any errors that pop up. You notice here it says running post create command. We'll cover that in a second. So what it was basically doing is running a command, waiting for SQL Server to be ready, then loading a database called project. So let's go kind of look at what this is doing. Also watch here, you'll see that additional things are going to start to appear. So we look at our dev container. We notice here, I'm going to minimize this because there's some distractions going on. Again, we're creating a settings for connecting to the local database. And then we are setting a property for SQL Data Projects .NET location to this location in .NET. And then we're saying, hey, I want you to add these extensions. So if you've been watching this, a couple of different things have been installed while we were waiting. So installed a extension called C# Dev Kit, one called C#, one called VS Code Bicep, and installed the Microsoft SQL Server, MS SQL, Azure Tools, VS Docker, Code Pilot, and Code Spaces. So if I go here now, you'll see I have SQL Server, Database Projects, Edge, Docker, and Azure. Before we go to do that, I'm going to show you a couple other things that were done. So now we said, hey, I want you to forward ports. So if you're used to Docker, this is saying within our containers, I want you to be able to listen to and forward any things to port 5000, 5001, 8000, and 1433. So if you're used to Visual Studio or C#, an ASP.NET app is typically by default on 5000 or 5001. The 8000 is just a general listener if you're going to include one. And then 1433 is SQL. So this says expose SQL Server to me. While we're at it, I'm going to start a different tool to show us that SQL Server is exposed. Now we're running this thing called post create command. So once the container is created, it's going to shell out to bash and run this script, post create command .sh with this option. So let's go and look at that. So we see, where's our scripts? SQL post create command. So this basically says we're going to connect to the database. This is the path for the DAP pack. Then I'm going to run star from sys databases and basically wait to see if the SQL Server is there. Once the SQL Server is there, we are then going to run this script to essentially deploy this DAP pack. So what that did was basically run the tool, the post deployment, which created our database. So if we go here and look at the SQL Server and look at databases, we have a database created called library that has multiple tables in it. So let's look at this author table, and I can see authors. So the cool thing about this is I was able to build out a initial database for us to use. So as a tech lead or an engineer on a project, you can build out a sample database, and this could be any scripts that you want. If we look here in our dev container folder, we have this post create command, which runs whatever scripts I need. In this case, it's going to run that SQL package command and say generate it. This install SQL tools gets us to install this tool right here, the SQL Server and this database projects. And I have the actual, where is it? Database, that's the database. So now I have everything I need to start. I can go from here and do a .NET build and start my application. Let's go look, see if we can have access to it. So let's zoom in here a little bit. Where's my zoom in command? That's down here. Let's get this up. I have to connect to a database first. So here I'm going to connect to a SQL Server. Actually, let's connect to an Azure SQL because it's going to complain that it's an Azure SQL because it's a Docker container. Let's do local host, and then it's SA, and I don't remember what the password was. Password is in an environment file, so I can just copy this. Go back to, where are you? There. Put in the password. The database is going to be application DB, I think, if I remember correctly. It's amazing how quick we forget. But you also have to go to advanced, and there's two properties you have to change. This is a new requirement for SQL. You have to make sure that the encrypt flag is set to true. And because this container has certificates, we have to trust that self-signed certificate. Now, if I go back and do a test, if I copy and pasted the password correctly, I should be able to connect to the database at this point. Now remember, this database is running inside a Docker container, and I can look here. We see that we have this container MS SQL dev running, which is running a copy of SQL and our application. And it failed because it's probably not application DB. What was it called? Library. So let's change this to library and then test connection. And there we go, I'm connected. So this is just as if I was using SQL Manager Studio, but I don't have that installed. On here, I use the JetBrains tool, DataGrip, to do that. And there we go, I can see that. So I'm able to connect to it with tools from outside because I've exposed these ports in the dev container file. Any questions before I move on to the next part? Cool. So the next thing is we're going to go to GitHub, and we're going to look at, oh, stop it. It's easier to close the connection before you shut down Visual Studio Code. So now we're going to go to joeguadagno.github.io, which is my personal blog that is actually in dev containers. So if I look at the dev container file here and open it up, let's zoom in a little bit. Oh, it doesn't really zoom in on the text, does it? So I'll just zoom in this way. So you see I have a name for it called joseguadagno.net. So when I open in Visual Studio Code, I can see that. It's using the Jekyll 2 build with Bullseye for the operating system. I'm not using any features in it because there's nothing I really need. Jekyll requires port 4000 when it's serving. And then there's an optional post create command to show the Jekyll version, but I don't need that. But for this, I highlight that I want these particular extensions. So I want this Markdown all-in-one, which has a bunch of utilities for Markdown. If you're not familiar with Jekyll, Jekyll is a Markdown-based static site generator. So you write your post in Markdown, run the Jekyll build, and it will convert your Markdown to HTML. So I use a couple of tools like Markdown all-in-one to do some helpful things like formatting tables and doing some other validations. I use some linter, emoji support, because what kind of blogger would I be without adding emojis to my blog posts? And because I am a programmer, my English and spelling is terrible, so I have a spell checker. I have this Markdown preview, which will basically inject style sheets that are in GitHub so I can see what it looks like on GitHub. My website is hosted on GitHub pages, even though you won't know because you go to josephguadagno.net. But behind the scenes, it's running on GitHub pages. I have GitHub Copilot as well as pull requests, action support, and this Ruby Lisp is a add-on. Jekyll runs Ruby behind the scenes, and this allows me to highlight if I have custom templates. And this token is only because I use something specific for my blog. So this is cool. Let's say I'm not at my desktop, but I'm at Joe's desk and he doesn't have Visual Studio Code. That's okay. I can come here, back to code on here, and I can click code spaces and then create a code space of it. So if you see here, it generated a similar Docker container, zany-funicular, then some really weird number .github.dev. So this is internally, GitHub is running dev containers behind the scenes, and this is how it's routing that container back to me. So I'm going to zoom back out. And let's zoom in here, which, where is it? I think it's Control Plus in this browser. So now I have Visual Studio Code running inside of Edge. So I'm using Edge to edit my blog. And you see, let's go here to one of my recent pages. No, I don't want to ask Copilot. No, I don't want to sign in. Let's say, let's do the About Me. So this is the About Me page. I'm going to change this. This is really Joe behind the scenes. So typically I would be able to start using it right away, but as you see, it's running the post create, so it's getting everything ready for me. And now you see I have a port open. Because I exposed the port 4000, it's saying, okay, I'm going to automatically do that, and it's going to go out to this. So let's go to terminal, and I need to do two things for it to work the first time, and that is a git pull to make sure I have the latest. And then I am going to do a bundle install. This is a Jekyll command to make sure everything is good. And then I am going to run this site. Now, the first time is the only time I need to run those two commands. After that, assuming I keep this up and running, I'm going to do a bundle execute JEKYLL serve, which will launch my website after it builds. Now, it typically takes, depending on your machine, or in this case, I'm running in code spaces, depending on the code space configuration, anywhere from 10 seconds to a minute and a half. I have a fairly high-powered code space set to this just because I do the demo semi-regularly. Now I see I have the ability to open in a browser. I click to open browser. I get this connecting to forwarding port. Now, if I look at the URL now, oops, I didn't want to do that. I want to do this. If I look at the URL now, it still has zany vernacular, but there's a -4000. Now, because we're not truly connecting to the port, what GitHub is doing, or Codespaces is doing, is translating this part, zany vernacular W5RX blah 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 -4000 to that dev container and forwarding port 4000. So if I look, oops, zoom out. I zoomed in way too far now. Come on, zoom out. Yeah, this happens sometimes when you share. Window minus, there you go. So I changed the about page. So let's go here. I see the about page, and there it is. I was able to successfully change it, and I can try this out. If I wanted, I can commit this change, but I really don't want to do that because that would be a lie. So Yes, allow it to see. I want to undo this change. So if you're used to Visual Studio Code, I can just do this and discard those changes and everything is back to normal. So using dev containers, you can actually edit the code and have a fully functional site or a fully functional development environment on GitHub, assuming you're hosted on GitHub and want to pay the code spaces fee. But this allows me to edit my site locally or in the browser, no matter what PC I have. So in theory, I can pull out my iPad, navigate to jguadagno.github.io, do code spaces, and do editing straight from my iPad. So we're going to stop that. Let's close you out. And then let's go back to PowerPoint. So we built the dev container, kind of showed some of the common settings. You can see more at the link below. And this is the actual full JSON reference. So you'll see every possible command. These are the primary ones that you'll use on a regular basis. So now when someone says to you that it doesn't work, you're using dev containers, now you can say it works on my machine. It's a DevOps problem. So that being said, here's some URLs that you can use. I'll keep it on screen for a second, but when I show my contact information or the QR code, that will take you to my site. You can download this site, download the slides, as well as see all these links. My contact info, I'll keep this open for a minute and then open up to any questions. And I probably should have did that. I'm going to pull over the slides to see if there's any questions in the chat. Oh, there was a bunch new. It didn't scroll down. I'm sorry. I do all my development in a licensed copy of Visual Studio Pro. Do I need to give a Visual Studio Pro to use conditions? Technically, Joe, you do not. So I'm just going to pull this over so you can see those. So the question is, I do all my development with Visual Studio Pro. Do I need to give up Visual Studio Pro to use containers? Technically not, because containers are Visual Studio Pro has dev containers. It's in preview now, so you can start playing around with it. And Copilot said no. Wow, that's a big Copilot answer. The live demo gods are especially cruel. Yes. No big. Yes. No, Codespaces run on ARM also. I just have it set to x64. How use these for QA testing? So that's a really good question. The easiest thing to do for QA testing. So if we go back to, and I'm going to just move this out and stop the PowerPoint for a second. So if we look at our SQL demo, let's go back and open up this one. And it opened up on a different screen, of course. You can add in, if you had this dev container set up, you can add in if you're using something like Jenkins or something, but you can actually just give this folder, this repo with the dev container, and then they could rebuild and have the same environment that the developers have. And if they're testing a website, which I didn't show before, but as long as you're exposing that port, they can run this, run the app with like .NET, run, and then open up Edge, Chrome, whatever, connect to that, kind of like I did when I demoed my website up here. See if there are any other questions. Nope. Okay. If you have any feedback, you can reach out to me on, I'll just throw this back over here. You can get the slides from here. My email address is also available, or to contact me. Any feedback I'm more than open for, especially if it's good. If it's bad, Joe Kunk was the presenter and I had nothing to do with it.
Thank you, Joe.
That being said, I don't see any questions. So thanks again, Stephen and Joe, for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. The link is posted in the chat for the survey. If you'd please take a moment and fill that out. I will also send that out via email if you happen to miss it in the chat.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Joe. I really appreciate the opportunity to ask questions live so that we can get a deeper understanding rather than just reading a piece of documentation and not necessarily getting the full benefit of it.
Yeah, it's the, yes, I agree. Sometimes, and sorry, I wasn't watching chat as much, and apparently the go-to chat doesn't scroll. Once you scroll to a point, it stops auto scrolling. So I didn't see that there are a bunch more questions.
Nope, that's fine. It's fine. Yeah, it's good stuff. Looking forward to giving it a try.
Yeah, it's super easy. It's also helpful for learning new languages because let's say you want to learn uh, Python or Ruby or something, you can just install dev containers and then create an environment for it. Like my blog runs with Ruby, but Ruby and Windows do not get along well. So I can actually edit my blog on my desktop as long as I have Docker and Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio. I can edit it without having to install and try to get Ruby to work on my machine. It's also super helpful if you have apps that have, a version of .NET or multiple versions of Node. Having multiple versions of Node on your desktop is really hard to switch between them, but having them in a dev container allows you to keep that isolated environment that you can reuse pretty easily. So I find it super helpful.
I have another question that's a little bit unrelated, but I'm curious for your answer. You're managing a new team with a new application, learning a new environment within the last 15 months, you said. What do you do for your documentation? I mean, I've looked at the possibility of maybe using Jupyter networks to have interactive documentation, but how do you manage documentation for yourself and also for things that you know will ultimately go to the customer?
Uh, for customer-based ones, most of the stuff is Word docs that we put on a portal internally for engineers.
Okay.
We use mostly Confluence for a lot of that and SharePoint. I'm trying to get the engineers to put notes and documentation inside the repos, like have a docs folder that explains the different pieces of an application so that the code travels, the docs travel with the code as opposed to having to go to a Confluence or SharePoint or whatever technology of the day we're using.
Okay.
Any others? Well, it was a great chat with everyone. If you ever need a speaker again, feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Joe.
Will do. Thank you, Joe.
Okay.